Welcome to Rain Narrator channel where we take you on a journey of deep relaxation and complete tranquility with the sound of raindrops adding an atmosphere of tranquility and comfort. Relax, enjoy, and prepare to enter the world of dreams. If you are looking for an ideal way to relax or calm your mind before sleep, you are in the right place. Follow us to get the best stories. It all started on an ordinary morning when I was rushing to work. My head was buried in my phone, too focused on emails and messages. As I was crossing the street, I didn't notice her coming from the opposite side. Out of nowhere, I bumped into her. It wasn't a hard collision, but it was enough to make her drop her coffee. The worst part? She had that look of surprise and slight frustration on her face. I quickly apologized, feeling embarrassed. She was still standing there looking at the mess on the ground. The coffee was spilling, and it was one of those moments where you can't really take it back. But then, she laughed. It was light, kind of infectious, like she found the humor in it all. And I didn't expect it, but I found myself smiling too. She asked if I was all right, and I tried to brush it off, but I could tell she was genuinely concerned. I couldn't help but notice how her eyes sparkled even when she was frustrated, and the way she tucked her hair behind her ear. It felt like a scene out of a movie, you know? She was standing there with a coffee stain on her shirt, and still she looked like someone who had a quiet kind of strength. I offered to buy her a new coffee. She hesitated at first, but then said, "Sure, but you have to promise not to spill it this time." It was funny, and it made me feel a little more comfortable. We walked to the nearest cafe. The conversation was casual at first, just small talk, but something clicked. We talked about everything and nothing at the same time. I learned that her name was Lily. She was a graphic designer, and she loved reading historical fiction. I told her about my hectic job at a marketing firm, how I was constantly running around, never really stopping to enjoy the moments. It wasn't like I was expecting anything to come out of it, but there was this sense of ease when we were talking, like the accident that brought us together wasn't an accident at all. We ended up sitting there for hours, and when I finally checked my watch, I couldn't believe how quickly the time had passed. We exchanged numbers before we parted ways, both of us a little unsure of what had just happened, but also strangely excited. I thought about her the rest of the day, wondering if she felt the same way. I hadn't even realized how much I missed genuine connection until I met her. It was like that moment, that small bump, had shifted something in me. Something I didn't even know needed shifting. We texted later that evening, laughing over how clumsy I had been. And just like that, we started talking more and more, the casual conversations turning into deeper ones. She became the person I looked forward to hearing from, the one I could be myself around without any pretense. It didn't take long for me to realize that what had started as a mistake on a crowded street had turned into something I couldn't quite put into words. But I knew one thing for sure. My life had changed that day, and it had changed because of her. It all started when I was 19, a little lost in life, and spending most of my time either working or swimming. Swimming had always been my escape, a place where I could shut out the noise of the world, where nothing mattered except the rhythm of my strokes and the endless stretch of blue before me. It's hard to explain why, but something about the water calms me. It feels like home. I wasn't expecting anything that day at the pool. It was a typical afternoon, warm, the sun reflecting off the water in a million tiny sparkles. I was doing my laps when I noticed her. She was at the far end of the pool, stretching before diving in. And even though she wasn't doing anything spectacular, I couldn't take my eyes off her. She had this quiet confidence about her. You know the kind I mean? Like she knew exactly who she was. Her hair was tied up in a loose bun, strands falling around her face, and I could see the subtle glint of concentration in her eyes as she adjusted her goggles. She dove into the water with such grace, gliding through it like it was part of her. I had seen a lot of people swim over the years, some good, some not so much, but there was something different about the way she moved. It was effortless, almost as if she belonged there in a way I could never quite manage to explain. I finished my laps, got out of the pool to catch my breath, and she was resting at the edge, leaning on the tiles, looking up at the sky. I walked past her, pretending I didn't notice her, but there was this pull, like the world had conspired for us to meet. I stopped for a moment. "Hey, nice strokes," I said, trying to sound casual. but the words felt heavy in my mouth, like I was stepping into unknown waters. She glanced up, and for the briefest moment, I caught a flicker of surprise in her eyes. "Thanks," she said, and then a smile, small but real, curved across her lips. "You too." Her voice had this warmth to it that was hard to ignore. We both stood there for a second, as if unsure of what to do next. Then, almost as if the water was pushing us together, she spoke again. "You come here often?" she asked, and I could hear the playful note in her voice. I smiled back, realizing I was probably grinning like an idiot. "Yeah, almost every day," I replied. "You?" "Most afternoons," she said. "I'm Emily, by the way." I took her hand without thinking. "I'm Jake," I said. The moment our hands touched, something electric passed between us, though I didn't fully understand it at the time. It was just a handshake, but there was a connection. I could feel it, like we were two puzzle pieces finally locking into place. Over the next few weeks, we started to run into each other at the pool more frequently. I always tried to time my swims so I'd be there when she was. We didn't talk a lot at first, just small exchanges between laps, but those little moments became important. Gradually, we began chatting more, about swimming, about our lives, about everything and nothing at all. She was smart, funny, and incredibly down to earth. Her life seemed so different from mine in some ways, yet we clicked. She was passionate about the water too, but for her, it was about feeling free, not escaping. I could see how much she loved the sport, how she had this natural understanding of the water that I envied. She could swim for hours and I could barely keep up. One day after we had been talking for a while, she suggested we race. I laughed, thinking it was a joke, but she was serious. "You up for it?" she asked, eyes challenging me. I was hesitant. I wasn't bad at swimming, but she was something else. Still, I didn't back down. "Sure, why not?" I said, a grin spreading across my face. We lined up at the starting edge of the pool, and I remember the moment before we both dove in. The tension, the excitement, the challenge, the sound of the water closing in around me. As I raced alongside her was unlike anything else, but as we neared the halfway point, I realized she was ahead of me. I pushed harder, but no matter what I did, she was always just a little faster. When we reached the finish line, she touched the wall first, and we both collapsed on the pool deck out of breath, laughing. "You're good," she said, still catching her breath. "But I'm better." I playfully nudged her. "Next time I'm winning." It became a thing after that, racing each other, always pushing the other to be better. There was a sort of unspoken understanding between us that the water brought out the best in us, that it was where we could be ourselves without any pretenses. As the days turned into weeks, I began to realize something that took me by surprise. I was falling for her. It wasn't the kind of love that came on like a storm, but something quieter, something that built over time. It was in the way she laughed at my dumb jokes, in the way she noticed the little things I didn't even realize I was doing. I started to wait for the days when I knew she'd be at the pool. I started looking forward to our conversations, our races, our shared silences as we rested at the edge of the water, side by side. I had never told anyone how I felt about the water, about how it was my escape, my way of dealing with the world. But with her, I didn't have to explain. She just understood. She had her own reasons for swimming. But somehow, when we were together in the water, it felt like we were part of the same current, like the same rhythm kept us in sync. It wasn't until one evening, after an especially hard race, one I had actually won, that we finally had the conversation I had been avoiding. We were sitting on the pool deck, drying off in the fading light of sunset. I could feel the warmth of her beside me, but I wasn't sure how to say it. "Jake," she said suddenly, breaking the silence. "You ever think about what would happen if we stopped swimming?" I looked at her, confused.
What do you mean?
If we stopped meeting like this," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "If we never saw each other at the pool again, what would we do?" It felt like the ground had shifted beneath me. My heart raced, and the water, which had always felt like my safe place, suddenly felt a little too deep. I didn't know what to say, but I had to be honest. "I don't want that," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "I don't want to stop seeing you, Em. I don't think I can. You're important to me." She looked at me for a long moment, and then slowly she smiled. "I feel the same way," she said softly, her hand brushing against mine. And that was the moment I knew. The moment I realized that everything that had happened, our swims, our races, our conversations, had brought us here. to this quiet, powerful understanding. The water had somehow led us to each other. We didn't need to say anything more. The words didn't matter. All that mattered was the connection between us, the quiet promise that we'd keep swimming together, no matter where life took us. Years later, when I think back on that summer, I don't remember the races or the laps as clearly as I remember the way we felt. It wasn't about the swimming anymore. It was about us finding each other in the vast, endless expanse of the water, and knowing without a doubt that we were where we were meant to be, together. I was 22 when I left. The world felt so big, so full of promises, and I was itching to find my place in it. My small village, tucked away in the mountains, was where I'd grown up, but I felt as though I needed to see beyond its borders. There were bigger cities, grander opportunities, and I couldn't wait to dive in. My parents didn't understand, but I promised I'd come back eventually. Years went by. I found myself in cities I never dreamed of living in, making a name for myself in a foreign land. But something always tugged at my heart, something I couldn't shake. There were nights I woke up in a cold sweat, the weight of homesickness on my chest. I would close my eyes and remember the green hills of my village, the smell of pine and earth after rain, and the sound of a river flowing through the valley. And then there was her, Elena. She was the first love of my life, and for the longest time, I thought I could leave her behind with everything else. But that was a lie. I could never really forget Elena. I tried. Oh, I tried, burying myself in work, in new faces, in the rush of city life. But the memory of her stayed like a shadow, always there, even on the brightest days. She was the one who got away, and it haunted me. I never thought I'd come back. I told myself that the past was the past, and I should just keep moving forward. But here I am, standing on the familiar road that leads into the village. I made the decision to return after the years of silence. Something called me back, the same voice that had always whispered to me in the quiet moments of my life. The first thing I noticed was how little had changed. The same stone houses, the same small shops with their wooden signs swinging in the breeze. The only difference was the people, older, yes, but there was an air of nostalgia everywhere. The village had preserved its soul, unchanged by the passing of time, unlike me. I walked into the local cafe, the place where Elena and I had spent so many afternoons. It was the only cafe in town, and I couldn't stop my heart from beating a little faster. The bell above the door jingled as I stepped inside, and my eyes scanned the room. And then, there she was. Elena. I had imagined this moment 1,000 times, but nothing could have prepared me for the sight of her. She was standing behind the counter, a tray of pastries in hand, her dark hair pulled back into a loose ponytail. Her eyes, the color of the lake we used to swim in, met mine, and for a second, time seemed to freeze. Her expression was unreadable, like she wasn't sure if she recognized me or if she even wanted to. But then, just as I was about to speak, a slow smile crept across her face. It wasn't the smile of a stranger, but the smile of someone who had known me, perhaps even loved me once. "Is it really you?" she asked, her voice soft but full of warmth. I nodded, feeling a lump form in my throat. "I didn't know if you'd be here. I didn't even know if you still lived in the village." "I never left," she said. "You, on the other hand, I thought you'd forgotten about us." I hadn't forgotten about her. I could never forget her. My mind was filled with memories of us, of the summer nights we spent talking under the stars, of the way she would laugh and light up the world around her, of the kiss we shared by the river before I left. I realized, standing there in front of her, that I had never truly moved on. Not from her, not from the love we shared. I had tried to bury it, but here she was, and I felt as though I had come home. But I was also terrified. I wasn't the same person I was when I left. I had changed in ways I couldn't fully explain. Would she even want to know me now? Would she see the boy she once loved, or would she see a stranger? "I never forgot," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I thought about you every day." Her eyes softened, and for a moment she just looked at me as if trying to read me. "It's been a long time, hasn't it?" I nodded, my heart racing. "Too long, but I'm back now." And just like that, the conversation seemed to flow. We talked about everything, the years that had passed, the things we had done, the things we had lost. She told me about her life in the village, how she had stayed behind to take care of her family's cafe, how she had never married, never moved away, and I told her about my travels, the people I had met, the places I had seen, but how none of it had ever felt like home. The more we talked, the more I realized how much I had missed her, how much I had missed this place, this feeling. We were no longer children, no longer the naive teens, who believed that love would last forever simply because we wished it to. We had both grown, but in some ways it felt like nothing had changed. It felt like no time had passed at all. As the afternoon stretched into evening, the sun began to dip behind the hills, casting the village in a golden glow. I could feel the pull of the past, of everything we had been, and I couldn't help but wonder if we could be that again, if we could rediscover what we had lost. "Do you ever think about the past?" she asked suddenly, her voice low. I smiled. "Every day." She took a deep breath, her eyes thoughtful. "I used to wonder what would have happened if you hadn't left, if we had stayed together, if we had fought for this." I reached out, gently touching her hand, and she didn't pull away. "I don't know, but I'm here now, and I don't want to leave again." She looked at me for a long moment. And then, without saying anything, she stepped around the counter and stood in front of me. I wasn't sure what she was thinking, but then she kissed me. A soft, slow kiss, the kind that spoke of everything we hadn't said in all those years. It was as though the world had come to a halt around us, and for that brief moment nothing else mattered. When we pulled away, her eyes were shining, and I felt a smile tug at my lips. "I'm not going anywhere this time," I promised. She smiled back. "Good." And just like that, I knew. I had come home, not just to the village, but to her. And this time I wasn't leaving. The road ahead was uncertain, but I knew that as long as we walked it together, it would be worth it. The love we once shared was still there, and perhaps it had been waiting all along for the right moment to return. And in that moment, I believed that love could find its way back, even after all these years. I never thought much about volunteering abroad. It seemed like something people did out of duty or charity, not necessarily something that would ever change my life. But when my friends suggested I go on this volunteer trip to help build homes for underprivileged communities in Central America, I thought, why not? I wasn't sure what to expect, but I wanted something different, something meaningful. I was 22, fresh out of university, and at that point, I didn't have any specific plans for my future, just looking for a new experience. That's when I met Sarah. We were on the same team, and it didn't take long for me to notice her. She was one of the first people to volunteer for the trip. She had this quiet, thoughtful way about her, but there was also something incredibly warm about her presence. She wasn't like the other volunteers I'd met, who were all loud and eager to take selfies at every moment. Sarah seemed grounded, and I found that comforting. I would see her in the mornings, adjusting her pack, greeting the locals, speaking their language effortlessly. On the second day, I was assigned to work with her on the construction site. At first, we barely spoke. She was so focused on the task at hand, moving cement, picking up bricks, and working in the heat as if it were second nature. I struggled a bit, dropping a brick here and there, feeling out of place. But she never laughed or judged me. She simply smiled and showed me how to do it right. "Here, let me help," she said, her voice soft but steady. And it was then that I realized she wasn't just competent, she was kind. I remember watching her mix cement with the strength of someone who had done it 100 times before, but her hands were gentle, careful. I felt like a complete amateur, but she didn't make me feel less than. It was as if she had this quiet confidence, not in a way that made me feel inferior, but in a way that made me want to do better. The days passed, and we spent a lot of time together. We'd work in the mornings and then take breaks in the afternoons, sitting together under a tree, sharing stories about our lives back home. She told me how she had grown up in a small town, how she'd always been drawn to helping others, how she decided to take time off from her corporate job to travel and give back. I was amazed by her bravery. She had left everything behind, her career, her life, her comfort zone, to do something she felt passionate about. I admired that. For me, the trip was an escape, a break from the world I didn't feel fully connected to. But for Sarah, it was more than that. It was a calling. And as I listened to her talk about the communities she had worked with in the past, I realized just how much heart and soul she put into everything she did. I felt this strange pull toward her, not just because of her kindness, but because she was living a life I had only dreamed of living. It was on the fourth day, as the sun began to set over the hills, that I finally spoke up. "Sarah," I said, awkwardly running a hand through my hair, "I don't think I could do what you're doing. I mean, you're really changing lives. You're amazing." She smiled softly, her eyes catching the fading light. I don't know if I'm changing lives, but I'm trying. It's not easy, though. It's hard work and it can be exhausting. But when you see the difference you're making, even in the smallest way, it's worth it. There was a pause as I tried to think of something to say. I think you're the kind of person who makes everything better. Like, you make the hard work seem worth it. Her gaze softened and she gave me a small laugh. You're sweet, but you're doing just fine. It's about the effort, not the result. I didn't know it at that moment, but that conversation marked the beginning of something more. Over the next few days, we worked side by side, laughed together, and found little ways to support each other. When I stumbled, she was there to pick me up. When she needed a break, I was there to make her laugh. Slowly, something shifted. The friendship we were building, one brick at a time, began to feel like something more. It was the final night of the trip. We had finished building the last house, and the community threw a small celebration for us. Music played and people danced, and for the first time in days I felt completely at peace. The work was done, the mission accomplished. But what I hadn't expected was that leaving this place, leaving Sarah, would be harder than I ever imagined. After dinner, we went for a walk. The stars were so bright above us and there was a cool breeze in the air. We walked in silence for a while, both of us knowing that the trip was coming to an end, that our time together would soon be over. Finally, Sarah spoke. I think I'm going to miss this. Miss being here. Miss helping. I know what you mean, I said, feeling a lump in my throat. I've never felt so connected to something in my life. She smiled and looked at me, her eyes full of something I hadn't seen before. I'm glad you came. I think you've learned something, don't you? I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. She was right. I had learned so much, not just about helping others, but about myself, about the kind of life I wanted to live. But more than that, I had learned that I didn't want to lose her. Sarah, I stopped myself, not sure how to put it into words. How could I tell her that in such a short time she had become so important to me? She turned to me as if she already knew. I know, I feel it too. It felt like time had slowed down as we stood there under the stars, the world around us fading away. Then, without a word, she reached out and took my hand, and in that moment, everything changed. The next morning, we said our goodbyes to the community, to the people who had welcomed us with open arms, and we boarded the bus back to the airport. I wasn't ready to leave, not just the place, but her, but I didn't have a choice. The trip was over. We promised to keep in touch, but what neither of us knew was that our connection, this bond we had built over the last 2 weeks, wasn't going to fade with time. We stayed in contact, and as the months passed, we talked more and more. I realized that Sarah wasn't just someone I had met on a volunteer trip. She was someone I wanted to build a life with. Eventually, we both made the decision to take another step. Sarah came to visit me, and we spent weeks traveling together, rediscovering the world we had once seen in a new light. And then one day, we both knew that it was time for us to stop saying goodbye. We made a life together, in a place where we could continue helping others, where we could both find meaning and purpose. And while I'll never forget the trip that brought us together, I realized that the greatest thing we built was the love we found between us. So here I am looking back, still amazed at how one decision, one trip, changed everything. It wasn't just about the houses we built. It was about building a future together. It's strange how time passes by unnoticed. You don't always realize what's happening in the moment, but when you look back, you see things clearly. I was her professor, of course. It feels like a lifetime ago now, but I remember the first time I saw her as though it was yesterday. I don't even remember why she caught my attention that day. She was one of many students, after all. But there was something in her eyes that stood out. There was a quiet determination there, a spark that spoke to me. Something that wasn't just about academia, but about her whole being. She was intelligent, of course, always asking questions that made me think twice, challenging me in a way that kept me on my toes. Her passion for the subject matter was infectious. I'm sure you know what it's like when you're teaching, and a student engages with what you're saying, truly listens and questions things deeply. It's rare, and it makes you feel alive in a way that nothing else can. But truthfully, it wasn't just her mind I was captivated by. There was an elegance to her, how she carried herself with such quiet grace, how she spoke so carefully but with such confidence. But back then I was her professor and she was my student. There was a clear boundary between us. I respected it and I kept my distance. I was always professional, always aware of the lines I couldn't cross, so I focused on teaching. But if I'm being honest, part of me always wondered what it would be like to know her outside of the classroom, to hear her laugh in a setting without grades or assignments looming over our heads. The day she graduated was the day everything changed. The ceremony was long, the speeches predictable, but as I stood there in my cap and gown, watching my students walk across the stage, I couldn't help but notice her, walking toward the stage, her gown billowing behind her, a proud smile on her face. She had made it. I couldn't help but feel a twinge of regret in that moment. Regret that I never could. Dee said the things I wanted to say to her, but what could I have said? Congratulations. That would have been ridiculous. I was just her professor after all. I tried to push those thoughts aside. The ceremony ended and we all went our separate ways. But fate had other plans, as it often does. A few weeks after graduation, I ran into her at a coffee shop in the city. I didn't recognize her at first, not in that setting. She wasn't a student anymore, she was just another person, just another face in the crowd. But when she saw me, her eyes lit up, and for a moment, it was like no time had passed at all. "Professor," she said, a playful smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "I didn't expect to see you here." I laughed, feeling like a fool for not recognizing her right away. "Well, I suppose even professors need coffee now and then." She grinned and motioned to the seat across from her. "Do you mind if I join you? It's a bit crowded today." "Not at all," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I wasn't sure what this meant, what this moment meant, but I knew I wanted to talk to her. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like a professor. I didn't feel like there was a wall between us. We talked for hours, not about academics or anything related to the classroom, no. This was something different. We spoke about everything and nothing at all. Her dreams, her plans, where she saw herself in 5 years, 10 years. I found myself drawn to her in a way I hadn't expected. The way she talked about the future, so full of hope and excitement, made me see the world differently. I'd been stuck in my own little bubble for so long that I hadn't even realized how much I needed to hear her perspective. At some point during that conversation, I realized something. I was falling for her. Slowly, imperceptibly at first, but it was happening. I kept reminding myself that this was not a good idea. She was young. She was still finding her way in the world. I was her professor, and even now I still saw myself as her teacher in some way. But I couldn't deny it. She was different, and I felt alive when I was around her. We continued meeting in the weeks that followed. Not every day, but enough to make it feel like we were building something. Something that couldn't be explained with words, but that was nonetheless real. We'd go to dinners, visit art galleries, walk through parks, and just talk about life. And each time I saw her, I felt more and more drawn to her. It wasn't just her beauty, though. She was undeniably beautiful. It was the way she made me see the world again. She made me feel things I hadn't felt in years, things I thought were long buried. It wasn't long before we both acknowledged the tension that had been growing between us. Though neither of us spoke of it directly at first, it was in the way our eyes met across the table. The slight brush of our fingers when we handed each other a cup of coffee. There was something there, something undeniable. One evening, after we'd walked through the city for hours, the night air cool against our skin, she turned to me and asked, "Do you ever wonder what could happen if we took this further?" I didn't answer right away. I didn't know how to answer. I was terrified, honestly. What would it mean? Could we really navigate the complexities of our past relationship? I had spent so many years trying to protect her, trying to keep her safe from the complications of being a professor-student couple. But now she was no longer a student. She was someone I cared about, someone I wanted in my life in a deeper way than I had ever anticipated. "I think about it a lot," I finally said, my voice quiet. "But I don't know if it's something we should do." It's funny how life works. You never really know when things are going to change, or how everything can fall into place, like pieces of a puzzle you didn't even realize you were putting together. But that's how I met her, unexpectedly, without any warning. Her name is Emily. I remember the first time I saw her. I wasn't even looking for her, really. It was a late afternoon, and I was at the park, sitting on one of those worn-out benches, just letting my mind wander. I liked being alone sometimes, just lost in thought, not having to speak to anyone. But then she passed by. I couldn't help but notice her. There was this calmness about her, something gentle. Her brown hair cascaded over her shoulders in soft waves, and she had this quiet way of walking, like she didn't need to rush anywhere. I watched her for a few seconds, not in a creepy way, I swear. It was just, well, she seemed different from everyone else. You know, when you meet someone and you just feel that connection, even if it's one-sided. That was the feeling I got. I didn't know her, and I hadn't even spoken to her, but I was already wondering if she might be someone important in my life. So the next few days were all about seeing her again. I found myself at that park more often, hoping to catch a glimpse of her. I told myself it was just a coincidence, just some sort of habit, like checking your phone without realizing it. But then one day there she was, sitting alone on a bench. I thought about walking over to her, but I hesitated. I mean, what would I say? I wasn't exactly good at these kinds of things. But then fate, or maybe just pure chance, had other plans. She smiled at me. Not a big smile, but just enough to make me feel like I wasn't invisible. That smile, though, it did something to me. I had never felt so drawn to someone so immediately. It was like the universe was nudging me, telling me this was the moment. I don't know what made me do it, but I finally walked up to her. My heart was beating out of my chest, and I could feel my palms sweating. "Hi," I said, sounding way more nervous than I intended. She looked up at me, and her eyes were warm, inviting even. "Hey," she replied with a soft smile. It wasn't the kind of smile you'd give a stranger, but the kind you'd give someone you might know or wanted to know. I sat down beside her, but I didn't know what to say next. I've never been good at small talk, and I wasn't sure if she was the type of person who liked talking to strangers, but somehow we fell into conversation easily. We talked about the park, the weather, books, and somehow everything just flowed. Over the next few weeks, I found myself spending more and more time at the park, waiting to see her again. And every time I did, we'd talk, just chat about life, nothing too deep at first. But even then, there was something that started to grow between us. I started to learn little things about her, how she loved reading, how she was always the one to take care of her younger brother, how she was so passionate about animals, and how she had this dream of traveling the world. I couldn't help but admire her. She had this lightness to her, this sense of joy that seemed to come from within. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She was just herself, and somehow that made her so much more beautiful than anyone I'd ever met. I'll admit, at first I didn't know if she saw me the way I saw her. It felt like I was falling for her, but I couldn't tell if it was just one-sided. She was kind, she was funny, and she always had this little laugh that made my heart skip a beat. But was I just another guy to her? I wasn't sure. But then one evening, after a long conversation about our hopes and dreams, I said something stupid. I had been talking about my fears, about how I was scared of never achieving anything, of just staying in the same place forever. I didn't even realize what I was saying until I noticed that she was looking at me differently. Her eyes softened, and for a moment she didn't say anything. It was like she was seeing me for the first time, really seeing me. "Don't be scared," she said quietly. "You're not alone in this, and you can achieve anything if you believe in yourself." Her words hit me harder than I expected. There was something in the way she said it, something so sincere and caring. I realized that I'd been holding myself back all this time, not just in life, but in letting someone in. I had been so afraid of letting anyone get close to me, of showing them how vulnerable I really was. But with her, it felt different. After that day, things began to change. Slowly but surely, I started to realize that maybe, just maybe, she felt the same way. She started texting me more, and we found ourselves talking even outside the park. We'd go for coffee, walk around town, or just sit together in silence. There was this ease between us that I couldn't explain. And then one evening, as we were sitting on a bench overlooking the lake, she turned to me with that soft smile of hers and said, "You know, I think we're more than just friends." And in that moment I knew she felt it too. "Yeah," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I think so too." From that point on, everything felt right. We didn't need to force anything. It just happened. We were there for each other, supporting each other, and slowly falling for each other in ways we hadn't expected. It was like we were writing our own love story, one moment at a time, and somehow everything just clicked into place. And now looking back on it all, I can't imagine my life without her. The way she makes me feel like I'm capable of anything. The way she listens to me like I'm the most important person in the world. The way we laugh together over the smallest things. I used to think love was some sort of fairy tale, something that only happened in movies. But with her, I realized that love isn't about grand gestures or perfect moments. It's about two people finding each other in the midst of ordinary days and making something extraordinary together. She wasn't just the girl I'd seen at the park that day. She became my partner, my best friend, and the person who made me feel whole. And now every day, I'm grateful for that one moment when I decided to sit down next to her on that bench. Because it was the moment everything changed. It was the moment I realized I wasn't just falling for her, I was falling in love. It all started in a small coastal town. I was just a regular young man, nothing special. Really, living in a town where nothing much ever changed. My name's Theo, and I was comfortable with my simple life. I had my close-knit group of friends, a modest job at the local bookshop, and the ocean breeze that always made everything feel a bit more peaceful. But everything changed the day she walked into my life. Her name was City, and she was unlike anyone I had ever met. She came to our town for a few months, staying with an older couple who had recently become friends with her family. I learned later that she was from Malaysia, and the first time I saw her, she was sitting by the window in the cafe across from the bookshop. She was reading a book, her dark hair flowing like silk around her face, the sun casting a warm glow on her delicate features. I could tell she was new here, someone who didn't quite fit in yet. I didn't know why I felt this pull towards her. Maybe it was the way she seemed so different from everyone around here. There was a quiet strength in her eyes, something that spoke of faraway places and unknown adventures. That's when I decided I had to speak to her. The next day I found myself walking into the cafe, pretending to browse through the shelves. She was sitting in her usual spot, absorbed in her book, not noticing me. I hesitated, unsure how to break the ice. I didn't want to scare her off or seem like I was invading her space, but I had to take the chance. I walked over to her table, cleared my throat nervously, and asked, "Excuse me, what are you reading?" She looked up, her brown eyes meeting mine with a kind of curiosity that instantly put me at ease. There was an almost innocent warmth in her smile as she answered, "It's a novel by a Malaysian author. It's about the life of a girl growing up in the city." I sat down with her, and soon we were talking about books, life, and our different cultures. She shared stories of Malaysia, the bustling streets, the food markets, and the festivals that filled the air with laughter and color. I told her about the quiet coastal life, the simplicity of our town, and the comfort in knowing everyone's name. As the days passed, I began to look forward to seeing her. Every morning, I'd sneak a glance at the cafe to see if she was there, and when I saw her, I'd find an excuse to walk over. Sometimes it was to talk about the books we were reading, and other times it was just to share a quiet moment, enjoying the warmth of each other's company. But as much as I felt drawn to her, I knew that there were barriers. We came from different worlds. City's family was traditional, deeply rooted in their culture. She had grown up with certain expectations, some unspoken, others outright expressed. And me? I didn't know the first thing about navigating a relationship that crossed cultural lines. My own family was more relaxed, open-minded, but I still felt the weight of those differences. I worried that no matter how much we cared for each other, the world would never see us as a match. One evening, as we sat by the beach, the golden horizon stretching before us, I finally spoke what had been gnawing at me for weeks. "Siri," I said softly, "I know we come from different places, and I don't want to make things harder for you." She turned her gaze towards me, her face soft but knowing. "Theo," she began, her voice gentle but firm, "love doesn't need to follow the rules others set for us. It's not about where we're from, it's about who we are when we're together." She paused, looking out at the sea before continuing. "In Malaysia, we have a saying, love transcends boundaries. I believe that." Her words touched something deep inside me, something I hadn't realized I was afraid of. Fear of not belonging, of not being accepted. But with her, I didn't feel afraid. I felt seen, understood. We were two people from different worlds. Yes, but in that moment we were the same, and so we began. Our relationship wasn't easy. There were stares, awkward silences, and the uncomfortable questions from both our families. My friends didn't understand the cultural differences, and hers were even more reserved. But Siti and I, we had each other, and that's what kept us going. Siti taught me so much about her world. We spent weekends cooking traditional Malaysian dishes, her showing me how to prepare nasi lemak and rendang, explaining the importance of each ingredient, the significance of the spices, and the history behind every meal. I took her to the quiet spots in our town, showing her the places I had grown up loving. The old lighthouse, the fishing docks, the cliffs that overlooked the endless ocean. I remember one evening when we were sitting by the water, I asked her what it was like to live in such a different culture from mine. She looked at me, a little smile playing on her lips, and said, "Sometimes it feels like the world is telling you to choose, but I don't want to choose between my home and yours. I just want to take the best parts of both and make something new." And that was the turning point for me. I realized that this wasn't about choosing between cultures. It was about blending them, respecting them, and creating something that was uniquely ours. Months passed, and as our love grew stronger, I started to see things from a different perspective. It was no longer about me being from a small town or her being from faraway Malaysia. It was about us being two people who had found each other across the divides of culture, distance, and expectation. Eventually, we made a decision together. We'd go to Malaysia, meet her family, and share our love openly. It wasn't going to be easy, but we knew it was the only way forward. Her family was hesitant at first, but over time, they saw how much we cared for each other. Slowly, the walls began to come down. I remember standing in front of her family, feeling the weight of their expectations, but also feeling proud of who we had become. And when they finally accepted us, when her mother gave me a gentle nod of approval, I felt like I could breathe again. Love, I realized, was the bridge between our worlds. We eventually got married in a beautiful ceremony that blended both cultures, traditional Malaysian customs, mixed with the simpler, more rustic elements of my hometown. It was a celebration of everything that made us who we were, a reflection of how far we had come and how much we had learned from each other. Looking back now, years later, I realized that Siti wasn't just a girl from another culture. She was the love of my life. And the thing about love is, it doesn't care about where you're from or where you're going. It just exists in the now, in the moments you share together. It's timeless. And that's the story of us. It was strange, you know, how the war somehow brought us closer, even though it tore everything else apart. I was just a boy when it all began, and so was she. We were too young to understand what was happening, how everything that we thought was normal was being ripped away from us. The sounds of bombs, the crackling of radio broadcasts in our homes, the screams in the night. It felt like life had split into two halves, the before and the after. But through all that chaos, there was her. I'll never forget the first time I saw her. I had been wandering the street, something I did often to clear my mind from the endless sirens and gunshots. She was sitting on the steps of an old bombed-out building, looking out at the skyline. Barely a skyline anymore, just twisted metal and crumbling brick. Her brown hair was tangled, and her dress was a little too big for her small frame. It was the way she was looking at the ruins, like she could still see something beautiful in it all, that stopped me in my tracks. "Are you okay?" I asked, not knowing what else to say. She turned to me, her face almost expressionless, but her eyes held a kind of sadness that I couldn't place. "I'm fine. Just thinking," she replied. We were both too young for this. Too young to be thinking about survival. Too young to be trying to piece together the broken parts of a life that used to make sense. But we were also too young to not notice each other. The war had taken so much away from us, but it had also given us this strange, fleeting chance to exist outside the usual rules. Maybe that's why, without saying much, we both understood that we were somehow connected in that moment. I don't know when it happened, when it went from seeing each other by accident to seeking each other out. Maybe it was that same hopelessness that kept us both coming back to that same spot day after day. She'd sit on the steps and I'd find some excuse to pass by. I'd ask if she needed food, if she needed help, even though I had so little to give. And she'd always say no, but she didn't really mean it. She always had a small smile, just enough to make me believe that maybe, just maybe, we could get through this together. I remember once, during a break in the fighting, she told me something I'll never forget. "People think the war is what breaks us," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "But it's not the war. It's what happens to us after. What we become when everything around us is lost." I didn't know what to say. How could I? She was right in a way I couldn't even begin to understand. The war had already taken so much from us, our families, our homes, our peace of mind. But the aftermath, that's where everything started to shift. We started seeing the world as this vast, broken thing that would never be the same again. And yet somehow she made me want to keep moving forward. It's funny when I think about it now how it all started. I never expected to fall in love with her. She was just Emma, the girl who lived down the street, the one who used to throw rocks at my window when we were kids, making me laugh with that mischievous smile of hers. We were inseparable back then. Our friendship was easy, carefree. We'd ride our bikes all around town, share secrets, and dare each other to do silly things, like jumping off swings into piles of leaves or pretending we were spies on secret missions. But as with most childhood things, time did what time does best. It changes things. Emma and I grew up. The playful innocence that defined our bond started to fade, though we still kept in touch. High school came and we went our separate ways, exploring different circles, different lives. But somehow we always found our way back to each other. Maybe because deep down I knew she was the one person who truly understood me, the one who knew my quirks, my fears, my dreams. It wasn't until I was in college that I started noticing her in a way I hadn't before. She wasn't just Emma anymore. She was everything, and it terrified me. I'd see her and remember the girl with the messy ponytail and scraped knees. And yet, she was becoming this beautiful young woman before my eyes. Her laugh now richer, her voice softer, her presence magnetic. It wasn't like I could hide it. I'd catch myself staring at her during those casual hangouts with our old group of friends, trying not to let on that I felt something more than just friendship. I mean, it felt like the worst thing in the world. What if it ruined everything? What if, after all these years, I messed it up? What if she didn't feel the same? The fear gnawed at me and I kept my distance, hiding behind my usual jokes, behind the comfort of our old dynamic. But then came that day, the day everything shifted. It was summer break and we were sitting on her front porch, just like we used to when we were kids, our legs dangling off the side of the steps. The air was thick with the scent of fresh grass and the promise of something new, something that was waiting to burst into the open. We were talking about nothing and everything, laughing about some old memory I couldn't even remember clearly anymore. And then she looked at me, really looked at me. And for the first time, I saw her as someone different, someone who wasn't just my friend. "You've changed," she said, her voice almost quiet. "Yeah, I guess we all have," I answered, trying to sound nonchalant, but my heart was pounding. I didn't know where she was going with this. "No," she said, her eyes not leaving mine. "You've changed. In a good way. I don't know when it happened, but I noticed." It was a simple sentence, a few words, but the weight of them hit me like a ton of bricks. Was she saying what I thought she was saying? I didn't dare to hope. We'd been friends too long for something like this to happen. But her eyes, those eyes told me everything. I felt that familiar rush, that spark I hadn't realized I missed. "I don't know what you mean," I said, though my voice wasn't convincing at all. She smiled then. That smile I remembered from all those years ago. But it was different now. It was softer, like she was letting me in, revealing something she'd been hiding, something she was willing to share. "I think you know exactly what I mean." That was it. The floodgates opened, and suddenly, the distance I'd kept between us. The fear, all of it didn't matter anymore. I leaned forward just a little bit, and her breath hitched. And for a moment there was silence. The kind of silence that only happens when two people, who know each other better than anyone else in the world, are on the brink of something beautiful. And then I kissed her. It wasn't the fireworks you see in movies. It wasn't dramatic. It was more like coming home after a long, tiring journey. Like finally understanding something you've been searching for all your life, but didn't know you were looking for. Her lips were soft, hesitant at first, but soon, she was kissing me back, and everything else faded away. The years of friendship, the insecurities, the fears, they all dissolved into the warmth of the moment. We were no longer just Emma and me. We were something new, something more. It didn't happen in an instant. It wasn't like one moment of clarity and everything changed. It was more like the first drop of rain on a dry earth, something that had been slowly building, unnoticed, until it couldn't be ignored any longer. We still hung out, still spent lazy afternoons together, still made each other laugh like we always had. But now there was something else there too. Something deeper. Something that made my heart race every time I saw her. We talked about it, of course, we had to, and she told me that she'd always felt something. Even before I did. She just hadn't known how to say it, how to bring it up. "I never wanted to lose what we had," she said. "But I think we're better than that now. I think we can handle this." And that was the beginning of us, of me and Emma. Not just the kids who threw rocks at windows, but the young adults who were figuring out what it meant to love and to be loved in return. We didn't have all the answers, and we still had our ups and downs, our moments of doubt. But we had something solid. A friendship built on trust, years of shared memories, and the realization that maybe, just maybe, we were always meant to be something more. So here I am looking back, and I still can't quite believe it. The girl I grew up with, the one who made me laugh, the one who shared my childhood, is now the woman I want to spend the rest of my life with. And it's strange because it doesn't feel like the start of something new. It feels like the continuation of something that was always there, waiting just beneath the surface. We've always been Emma and me, and maybe that's exactly what love is. Finding the person who has always been there, even when you didn't know it. I never thought I'd fall for her, not in a million years. When I first met her, I thought she was everything I could never stand in a person. Loud, confident, and stubborn. But most of all, she was the kind of girl who always had to have the last word. And that drove me crazy. I was used to people respecting my space, my quiet, and my rules. So when she came into my life, it felt like everything was being thrown out of order. She wasn't just at odds with me in small ways. No, she challenged me constantly, and for no good reason as far as I could tell. We had different views on practically everything. School, music, people, life. And she was the type to argue and debate like she was trying to prove something, not just express her opinion. Every day we fought, and somehow, we always found ways to get under each other's skin. If you told me back then that I would ever care about her, I would have laughed in your face. We were like fire and ice, always clashing, always at odds. I didn't just dislike her, I hated the way she always made me feel like I was the one who was wrong, even when I knew I wasn't. She seemed like she could do no wrong, while I was stuck being the one who would end up apologizing after every argument. The worst part? She never apologized, ever. But things started changing when we were forced to work together on a school project. The teachers had a system and we got paired up. I remember the moment when I found out. My stomach dropped. There was no way this could go well. I knew we'd be at each other's throats from start to finish. But to my surprise, it wasn't as terrible as I thought. At first, we avoided talking unless we absolutely had to. We just did the work, kept it professional, and counted down the minutes until we could go our separate ways. But something changed over time. Little by little, as we worked more closely, I started to see a different side of her. The way she focused, the way she took responsibility when things went wrong, how she handled challenges with this quiet determination. It was impressive. I started respecting her for it, but I hated that I did, because it meant I had to admit that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't the person I thought she was. And I won't lie to you, I started noticing other things too. Her laugh, how she bit her lip when she was thinking hard about something, the way she looked at the world like it was her own canvas, always seeing possibilities others didn't. It was annoying, really. I hated how easy it was to get lost in watching her, trying to figure out who she really was, because it didn't make sense. She was the person I argued with the most, the person I least liked. And yet here I was, captivated by her every move. I didn't know when it happened, but one day, I found myself waiting for her to text me. I found myself actually looking forward to seeing her, to hearing what she had to say, even when I knew it would irritate me. I'd catch myself smiling after one of her sarcastic remarks, even though I told myself I'd never let her get to me. But she did, and somewhere between those long nights, working together and the random conversations, I realized I wasn't just tolerating her anymore. I was starting to like her. The turning point was a cold afternoon in late autumn. We were sitting in the library, working on our final project draft. The conversation started as usual, about something trivial. But then something shifted. She was talking about her dreams for the future, and for the first time I didn't hear her usual bravado. I heard vulnerability. She was worried about how her life was going to turn out, what people would think, what she was capable of, and it hit me. She was just as scared as I was. The girl who always seemed so sure of herself had the same doubts and fears as the rest of us. I don't know why, but in that moment it felt like everything changed. The walls I had built around myself to keep her out started to crumble. I stopped seeing her as the enemy, and I began to see her as someone who might understand me in ways no one else could. Someone who, like me, was trying to figure things out in a world that kept pushing her to be something she didn't want to be. I guess that was when I realized that I was in deep with her. But it wasn't an easy road. It's not like we magically became this perfect couple after that day. No, there were still the fights, the misunderstandings, the awkward silences. But somewhere along the way, we stopped fighting against each other. We started fighting for each other. We were no longer trying to prove who was right or wrong. We were just there for one another. In our own way, we had our moments, the ones where I'd look at her and wonder if I was crazy for falling for someone I once thought was my worst enemy. But then there were the other moments, the ones where she would hold my hand and smile, that smile that always made my heart race, the ones where I realized I wasn't just falling in love with her, I was falling in love with the person I'd gotten to know beneath all that bravado and stubbornness. I'll never forget the day I finally told her how I felt. It wasn't some grand confession or dramatic speech. I just looked at her a bit nervous and said, "I don't know when it happened, but I think I'm in love with you." She didn't say anything at first. She just looked at me, those big brown eyes full of surprise. Then she smiled, and it was all I needed. It wasn't perfect. We were still two very different people, with very different worlds, but it didn't matter anymore. We had learned how to stop fighting. We had learned to understand each other, to accept the flaws, to care even when we didn't understand everything. In the end, I never imagined that the girl I used to argue with, the one who could drive me crazy, would become the person I couldn't imagine my life without. But here we are, writing our story together, and it's been more beautiful than I ever could have predicted. It was just another typical day at work when I first noticed her. Her name is Emma, and she's been with the company for a few months now. I didn't think much of her at first, just another new hire, who would blend in with everyone else. But then, I started seeing her around more often. At first, it was those brief moments passing by in the hallway, exchanging polite smiles as we went about our business. But one day, we were both in the break room at the same time. I was grabbing a coffee and she was fumbling with her phone, clearly frustrated with something. I don't know what made me do it, but I asked if she was okay. She looked up at me, eyes a bit surprised, but smiled and shrugged it off. "Just a bad day, you know how it is," she said, her voice soft but warm. From there, something shifted. We started chatting more frequently about work, the weather, random stuff. I began looking forward to those little moments. The thing is, she wasn't like anyone else at the office. There was something genuine about her, like she didn't have a care in the world about keeping up with all the corporate nonsense. She was just herself. Then one day, after weeks of small talks, she asked me if I wanted to grab a coffee after work. I was caught off guard. I don't know why, but I had this feeling that maybe she felt something too. We met after hours, and it felt like time slowed down. The conversation was easy, too easy actually. It didn't feel forced, no awkward silences. I think we both realized right then that we enjoyed each other's company a lot more than we expected. As the weeks passed, our connection grew stronger. We'd walk out of the office together, talk about our dreams, laugh over silly things. It was strange because as much as I wanted to be close to her, I didn't want to rush anything. I could feel this quiet tension building, like we both knew there was something more, but neither of us wanted to admit it. Then one night, as we were leaving work, she turned to me with a hesitant smile. "I don't know why, but I think I'm falling for you," she said. My heart stopped. I had been hoping for something like this, but hearing her say it out loud was completely different. I didn't say anything right away. I just looked at her, took a step closer, and kissed her. It was simple, but it felt like everything I had been waiting for. After that, things between us changed, but in the best way possible. We were still the same, Emma and me, sharing lunches, laughing over work drama, but now there was something deeper between us. I knew we had something real, something worth holding on to. The funny thing is, this all started in the most ordinary of places, a simple office, a routine job. But somewhere between the emails and meetings, I found a love I never saw coming.